There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, and only in retrospect do you see them for what they were. The subtle shifting of tectonic plates, the silent turning of a page in the book of your own becoming. For me, that moment wasn't a grand explosion or a sudden revelation. It was the soft weight of a woolen blanket, held between my hands in the half-light of my own apartment, and the question of whether or not to cross the 3 feet of space that separated me from him. It was a question that held the entire world. He was asleep on my couch. Leo. His form was a long, graceful line against the dark gray upholstery, one arm thrown over his eyes to block the insistent silver of the moon pouring through the window, the other hanging limply toward the floor, fingers slightly curled. The rise and fall of his chest was a slow, steady rhythm in the profound quiet of 3 in the morning, a quiet so deep it felt like the space between heartbeats. I stood in the doorway of the hall, a sentinel in my own home, caught in the gravitational pull of his stillness. This had become a ritual, this silent vigil. He would arrive, a storm contained in a human body, all restless energy and a smile that never quite reached his eyes anymore. And he would talk until the words ran out, leaving behind a silence filled with the things he couldn't say. Then, inevitably, sleep would claim him right there, on the worn cushions that had become his unofficial sanctuary. My sanctuary. And I would watch. I would stand in the liminal space of the hallway, my own bedroom door open behind me, a silent invitation he never acknowledged, and I would just watch him breathe. Each night, the debate was the same. The blanket, folded neatly on the armchair in the corner, was a stand-in for a much larger question. To cover him was an act of care, a simple gesture of friendship. But in the charged silence of my apartment, in the fiercely protected space of my own heart, where he had taken up residence without ever knowing it, the act felt like a confession. It felt like laying a hand on his forehead, like whispering a truth he wasn't ready to hear, a truth I wasn't brave enough to speak. It was an admission of the depth of my seeing him, the way my focus narrowed to just him in a crowded room, the way the simple, unvarnished fact of his existence had become a foundational truth of my own. My world was a camera, and he was the only subject that mattered. Tonight, the air was colder. A draft whispered from the window frame, and I saw a tremor run through his shoulder. That was all it took. The internal architecture of my hesitation crumbled. I moved without thinking, my feet silent on the old wooden floors. The blanket was soft and heavy in my hands, smelling faintly of cedar and clean linen. I approached the couch as one might approach a sleeping animal, with a reverence bordering on fear. Each step was a universe of consequence. As I leaned over him, his scent rose to meet me. Not the sharp, chlorinated smell of the pool that usually clung to him like a second skin, but something softer, more fundamentally him. It was the smell of clean sweat and the laundry detergent I used, and something else, something warm and uniquely his own, like sun-baked earth after a rain. I held my breath, my own pulse a frantic drum against my ribs, and gently, so gently, I draped the blanket over him, tucking it around his shoulders, my fingers brushing the warm, solid muscle there for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric, a spark in the dark that made my whole body ache with the force of what I was holding back. He stirred, a low murmur in his throat, and settled deeper into the cushions, pulling the blanket closer without waking. And I retreated, back to my doorway, my hand tingling where it had touched him. I had crossed the room, but the real distance, the vast, terrifying ocean between my truth and his, remained. I had only offered a blanket against the cold, but it felt like I had offered him everything. We had met at a random kickback, the kind of party that defined the periphery of our college lives. It was hosted by someone neither of us really knew, in a house that smelled of stale beer and youthful desperation. The music was a physical force, a bludgeoning beat that made conversation impossible and loneliness feel communal. I hated parties like that. I always felt like a ghost, drifting through rooms, an observer cataloging expressions, my camera a welcome shield I hadn't thought to bring that night. I was leaning against a wall, nursing a plastic cup of something forgettable, trying to master the art of looking like I belonged when I first heard it. It wasn't the music or the shouting, it was a laugh. It was a bright, clean, beautiful sound that cut through the noise like a flare in the fog. It was completely unself-conscious, a pure expression of joy that was so out of place in that cynical, posturing environment that it felt like a miracle. My head turned, an involuntary motion, and I followed the sound to its source. And there he was, Leo. He was standing in the center of a small, wrapped circle, his head thrown back, his throat exposed. Light from an overhead fixture caught in his hair, turning the brown strands to threads of bronze. He was telling a story, his hands carving the air, his whole body invested in the narrative. I couldn't hear the words, but it didn't matter. I was captivated by the energy pouring off him, a radiant warmth that drew people in. He was the sun, and everyone else was a planet, caught in his orbit. I remember thinking, with a clarity that felt profound at the time, that he was the most alive person I had ever seen. He was all motion and light, a stark contrast to my stillness and shadow. He finished his story, and the group erupted in another wave of laughter. His eyes, bright and crinkling at the corners, scanned the room, and for a heart-stopping second, they met mine. He gave a small, inclusive smile, a gesture that said, "You're in on this too," before his attention was pulled away by someone at his elbow. But that one look was enough. It was a hook, and I was caught. I, who spent my life behind a lens, framing the world and keeping it at a safe distance, had been seen. For the rest of the night, I was acutely aware of him. I tracked his movement through the crowded rooms, a magnetic north I couldn't ignore. I watched him talk to a dozen different people, his charm effortless, his presence a gift he gave freely. And a quiet, unfamiliar ache started to grow in my chest. It wasn't just attraction, it was a deeper kind of recognition. It was the feeling of a locked room inside of me suddenly finding its key. Eventually, the party began to thin, the energy bleeding out into the cool night air. I was making my escape, slipping toward the front door, when a voice called out behind me. "Hey, wall guy," I turned. It was him, Leo, leaning against the same patch of wall I had occupied hours earlier. He had a lopsided, tired grin on his face. "You were there all night," he said, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. "You're a quiet one." I felt a flush of heat creep up my neck. My carefully constructed invisibility had failed. "I'm not a big party person," I managed, my voice sounding rough to my own ears. "Me neither," he said, and the confession was so unexpected it made me blink. "Really? You seemed like the king of it," he laughed, a softer, more weary version of the sound I'd heard before. "Nah, that's just a switch I flip. It gets exhausting." He pushed himself off the wall and walked toward me, extending a hand. "I'm Leo, I know," I said, and then immediately wished I could swallow the words. A small frown flickered between his brows. "I mean, I heard people say your name," I clarified, my face now burning. I took his hand. His grip was firm and warm. "I'm Alex," I said, finally naming myself. That was the beginning. It was a beginning as unassuming as any other. We walked out into the cool, pre-dawn air together, our footsteps echoing on the empty sidewalk. We discovered we lived in the same cluster of off-campus apartment buildings, a coincidence that felt like fate. He was on the swim team, which explained the broad shoulders and the disciplined energy I'd sensed. I was a photography major, which, he claimed, explained my professional-level lurking. I should have been offended, but the way he said it, with a gentle, teasing smile, made it feel like a compliment, like he had seen my nature and accepted it without judgment. We exchanged numbers under the orange glow of a streetlight, a mundane transaction that felt momentous. As I walked away toward my own building, I felt a strange sense of buoyancy, as if the ground were slightly less solid beneath my feet. I hadn't taken a single photograph all night, but I had a perfect image burned into my mind. A boy with bronze hair, his head thrown back in a laugh that could silence a room. Our friendship grew in the way a photograph develops in a darkroom. A slow, magical emergence of shape and detail out of an undifferentiated gray. It was easy. easier than any friendship I had ever had. With Leo, my natural quietness wasn't a deficit. He filled the silence with effortless chatter about his classes, his swim practice, the ridiculously demanding coach who seemed to think humans were amphibious. He talked, and I listened, and it was a perfect equilibrium. I was the steady shore to his restless ocean. He would text me at random hours, just swam a personal best. Thought you should know. Or, this poli-sci lecture is killing me. Send help. Or coffee. I became his designated documentarian, the one he'd call to take pictures at his swim meets. Through my lens, I learned the geography of him. I learned the precise way the muscles in his back coiled and released as he launched himself from the starting block. I learned the pattern of freckles scattered across his shoulders, visible only when the sun hit him just right. I learned the look of fierce concentration on his face before a race, a stark contrast to his usual easygoing demeanor. And I learned the look of exhaustion and triumph afterward, his chest heaving, water streaming from his hair, a smile of pure relief spreading across his face. I captured it all, hundreds of images, freezing moments of his strength and his vulnerability. My hard drive became a secret museum dedicated to him. He loved the photos. He said I made him look like a superhero or something. He didn't understand that I wasn't creating anything. I was just capturing what was already there. I was just showing him the way I saw him. He had a girlfriend, Chloe. She was nice enough, I suppose. Pretty, smart, and as effortlessly social as he was. They made sense together. They were a matching set. When she was around, I felt my observer status keenly. I would fade into the background, a friendly satellite to their binary star system. I'd watch him with her, the casual way he'd drape an arm around her, the private smiles they'd exchange. And each time, I felt that quiet ache in my chest, a dull, persistent throb. It was a lonely feeling, but it was a familiar one. I was good at loneliness. I had built a life around it, a fortress of solitude where my feelings could exist safely, unexamined and unspoken. Loving Leo from a distance felt like a part of that architecture. It was a secret I kept in the deepest, most fortified room of my heart, a room I never planned on letting anyone enter, least of all him. Friendship was the price of admission to his life, and it was a price I was more than willing to pay. I would take whatever piece of him he was willing to give, and I would be grateful for it. I convinced myself it was enough. The shift, when it came, was not a gentle tremor but a seismic event. It was a phone call on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I was in the campus darkroom, the smell of fixer sharp in the air, watching an image of Leo emerge in the developing tray. One from his last meet, cutting through the water, a study in fluid dynamics and raw power. My phone, set to vibrate on a nearby shelf, buzzed insistently. I almost ignored it, lost in the alchemy of the moment. But it didn't stop. Annoyed, I wiped my hands and answered it. Hello, Alex. It was him. His voice was wrecked. It was a raw, broken thing, stripped of all its usual warmth and confidence. It was a sound I had never heard before, and it sent a spike of pure adrenaline through me. Leo? What's wrong? Where are you? Chloe and I. We broke up, he choked out, and the words were followed by a ragged, wet sound that I recognized as a sob he was trying to swallow. My own heart felt like it stopped. All the air went out of the small, dark room. Oh, Leo, I breathed. Where are you? I'm just walking. In the rain. I don't know where to go. His voice was small, lost. The image of him, the vibrant, sunlit boy I knew, wandering aimlessly in a downpour, shattered me. Come here, I said, the words leaving my mouth without a conscious thought. Just come to my apartment. Now, are you sure? I don't want to bother you, Leo. Just come here. There was a pause, and then a quiet. Okay, the line went dead. I stood there in the red glow of the safe light, the half-developed photograph of him floating in the tray, a ghost of his former strength. The world had reconfigured itself in the space of a 30-second phone call. The binary star had collapsed, and he was falling toward me. I abandoned everything, quickly rinsing the print and hanging it to dry before rushing out of the darkroom and into the storm. The rain was cold and relentless, plastering my hair to my forehead as I sprinted the few blocks to my building. I made it inside just a minute before he arrived. my heart pounding from both the run and a terrifying, hopeful anxiety. He appeared in the doorway like a drowned ghost. His hair was dark with rain and slicked to his skull, his clothes were soaked through, and his face was a ruin. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, his skin pale. He was shivering, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that shook his whole frame. He looked at me, and his beautiful, confident mask was gone. All that was left was a boy, lost and hurting and utterly exposed. I didn't say anything. I just pulled him inside, closed the door on the storm, and wrapped my arms around him. He was cold and damp, but he folded into my embrace, his head dropping onto my shoulder, and for the first time, he let the sob go. It was a wrenching, ugly sound, torn from the deepest part of him, and his body shook with the force of it. I just held on, my hand stroking his wet hair, murmuring meaningless, comforting sounds. I held him as the dam of his composure broke and poured out of him, a flood of grief and confusion. In that moment, there was no Chloe, no unspoken feelings, no fear. There was only him, and his pain, and the undeniable, instinctual need I felt to shelter him from it. I was his shore, and the tide had finally, violently, come in. That was the first night. The first time the unspoken rules of our friendship were rewritten. After he had cried himself into a state of raw-boned exhaustion, I made him change out of his wet clothes and into a pair of my old sweatpants and a hoodie that were comically large on me, but fit him perfectly. I made him tea, which he held in trembling hands, staring into the steam as if it held the answers to unasked questions. He didn't talk about the breakup, not really. He just uttered fragments, broken pieces of a story I could only guess at. She said, "I wasn't really there, I thought we were fine. It just ended." I didn't press him. I just sat with him on the couch, a silent, solid presence, letting him know he wasn't alone in the wreckage. As the evening bled into night, his energy completely evaporated. His eyelids began to droop, his head nodding forward before he'd jerk it back up. "I should go," he mumbled, but he made no move to stand. "Don't be an idiot," I said, my voice softer than the words. "You're not going anywhere. You can crash here." He looked at me, his eyes cloudy with exhaustion and something that looked like gratitude. "On the couch." "Yeah, on the couch," I said, keeping my tone light, casual, as if it were the most normal thing in the world, as if my heart wasn't performing a frantic, complicated rhythm in my chest. "It's comfortable enough," he just nodded, too tired to argue. I got him a pillow and the blanket from the armchair, the same one I had hesitated over in my mind so many times before. This time, there was no hesitation. I unfolded it and draped it over him as he curled up on the cushions. "Thanks, Alex," he whispered, his voice already thick with sleep. "You're a good friend, a good friend." The words were a comfort and a sting. I turned off the main lights, leaving only the small lamp in the corner burning, a tiny lighthouse in the dark. I retreated to my usual post in the hallway doorway, watching him. This time, it was different. He wasn't just a visitor, he was a refugee. I had given him shelter. The line had been blurred, not by a daring confession or a bold move, but by a simple act of compassionate necessity. He needed a safe harbor, and I had opened my port. As I finally went to my own bed, I lay awake for hours, listening to the sound of his breathing from the other room. A new chapter had begun. A ritual had been born from a storm, and I had no idea where it would lead. I only knew that he was here, just a few feet away, and for the first time, the space between us felt less like an empty chasm and more like a shared room. The ritual began in earnest after that first night. It wasn't spoken of, not directly. There was no formal arrangement. But one night of him on my couch bled into two, and then it became an unspoken assumption. After his evening practices, he wouldn't go back to his now empty apartment, the one he had once shared with Chloe, a space haunted by shared memories and a future that had evaporated. He would just come to mine. Sometimes he'd have a flimsy excuse, a textbook he'd forgotten, or a question about an assignment he could have easily texted. But as the days turned into weeks, even the pretexts fell away. He would just appear at my door around 10 o'clock, looking tired and adrift, and I would just let him in. Our evenings developed a rhythm, a quiet liturgy of comfort. I would make tea, or he would bring takeout. We'd watch a mindless movie or just sit in a comfortable silence, the air thick with the low hum of the city outside and the unsaid things between us. My couch became the centerpiece of our shared world. It was old and a little worn, the cushions indented from years of use, but it was sturdy. It became his bed, his confessional, his raft in the turbulent waters of his own life. At first, he would talk about her, about the breakup, in circles of confusion and hurt. I listened, providing the steady, non-judgmental presence he needed. I was his sounding board, the wall he could throw his grief against until it was exhausted. I never offered advice. I never said a bad word about her. I just listened. I absorbed his pain, filtering it through the deep well of my affection for him, until it became something manageable. My role was clear. I was the healer, the caretaker. It was a role I slipped into easily, a role that gave my secret love a purpose, a function. It was a way to love him actively, without ever having to name it. And every night, he would fall asleep on that couch. The transition was always a slow fade. His voice would grow softer, his sentences trailing off, until he would finally succumb, surrendering to the exhaustion that was his constant companion. And my vigil would begin. I would watch him, this beautiful, broken boy, and the ache in my chest would be a physical presence. It was a complex emotion, a tapestry woven from threads of profound tenderness, sharp, possessive joy that he was here, with me, and a deep, sorrowful guilt. I felt like a thief, stealing these moments of intimacy under the guise of friendship. He was vulnerable, and I was here, hoarding his proximity, cataloging the details of his sleeping form like a miser counting his gold. The way his lashes cast long shadows on his cheeks. The way his mouth would fall slightly open. The occasional soft snore that was somehow endearing. As the weeks went on, the physical boundaries between us began to soften, to blur at the edges. The change was subtle, incremental. It started with him being less careful about where he sat. He'd sink onto the couch closer to me than necessary, our thighs almost touching. Then came the casual, unthinking touches. A hand on my arm to emphasize a point. A foot nudging mine as we watched TV. Each touch was a small detonation in my nervous system. I became hyper-aware of the space around my body, a field of energy that buzzed whenever he was near. I had to train myself not to react, not to flinch away, or, worse, lean in. I had to maintain the carefully constructed facade of the unfazed, platonic friend. It was the most difficult acting job of my life. One night, about a month into this new reality, the ritual escalated. We were watching some old black and white movie I'd put on, something quiet and atmospheric. He had been silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the screen but seemingly unseeing. He looked utterly depleted, the strain of the past weeks etched onto his face. Without a word, he shifted, turning on his side and drawing his long legs up onto the couch. He rested his head not on a pillow, but on my thigh. The action was so simple, so matter-of-fact, that I froze, my entire body going rigid. I couldn't breathe. My thigh was on fire, a localized supernova of sensation. I could feel the warmth of his cheek, the soft tickle of his hair through the denim of my jeans. He sighed, a long, shuddering exhalation of pure weariness, and seemed to sink into me, as if he had finally found solid ground. My mind went into overdrive, a frantic search for meaning. What was this? Was it a calculated move? A test? Or was it simply the action of a person so bone-tired and in need of comfort that he had ceased to think about the implications? I stared down at the top of his head, at the whirl of his dark hair, and my heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. I wanted, more than anything, to reach down and run my fingers through his hair, to soothe the tension I could feel radiating from him. But I didn't. I remained perfectly still, a statue with a sleeping boy in its lap. My role was to be the steady shore, and shores do not move. They simply endure. They accept the weight of what washes up on them. So I sat there, for what felt like hours, my muscles screaming in protest, until the movie ended and the screen went black, plunging the room into near darkness. I sat there until my own leg had gone numb, a pins and needles sacrifice I was willing to make. He was trusting me with his exhaustion, with his unguarded self. It was a sacred trust, and I was terrified of breaking it. This became the new normal. The couch was no longer just his bed, it was our shared space. He would lie with his head in my lap while I read or sketched, his breathing a slow, steady presence against my leg. Sometimes, as we sat side by side, he would lean his head against my shoulder, falling asleep there. The first time it happened, I remember thinking that the weight of his head was the heaviest and most precious thing I had ever held. I would sit for hours, unmoving, my own neck stiffening, just to give him a few more minutes of peace. The physical intimacy was a strange and torturous paradise. It was everything I had ever wanted, and it meant nothing. Or, I had to believe it meant nothing. It was born of his need, not his desire. He was seeking comfort, not me. I was just a convenient, warm body, a piece of furniture that happened to breathe. I told myself this over and over, a mantra to keep my hope in check. Because hope was the enemy. Hope was the thing that could destroy everything. The open door to my bedroom became a symbol of this exquisite torture. Every night, after he had fallen asleep on the couch, I would stand in the hall and look at that open door, then at him. The invitation was always there, silent and screaming. There is a bed. There is more space. There is more comfort here. But I never said the words. And he never asked. It was a line we both seemed to understand could not be crossed. The couch was a neutral zone, a DMZ of intimacy. My bedroom was something else entirely. It was a territory of intention, and we were both, it seemed, cowards. So the ritual continued, suspended in its amber of ambiguity. He would sleep on the couch, sometimes with his head on my lap. I would cover him with the blanket. And I would go to my own empty bed, the space beside me a cold and cavernous void, and lie awake, listening to the sound of him breathing in the next room, so close and so impossibly far away. I photographed him constantly during this period, but differently than before. I stopped taking pictures of him at the pool. The superhero was gone, replaced by someone quieter, more contemplative. My camera became an extension of my silent watching. I took pictures of him as he slept on the couch, the morning light tracing the line of his jaw. I took a picture of his hand, resting on a book he'd failed to read, the fingers relaxed in sleep. I took a picture of the back of his neck as he stared out my window, lost in thought. These were not photos for him. They were for me. They were my private language, my way of saying all the things I couldn't. They were portraits of vulnerability, of trust, of the quiet, fragile beauty of the space we had created. In the darkroom, I would watch his image appear on the paper, a ghost becoming real under my careful guidance. I was developing pictures of him, and I was developing a love so deep and patient it frightened me. It was a quiet, consuming, and utterly hopeless devotion. The crossing happened on a night that was no different from any other, which is perhaps why it was so profound. It was a Tuesday in late autumn. The leaves had all fallen, and the trees outside my window were skeletal against a bruised purple sky. Leo had been quiet all evening, quieter than usual. He had a big meet coming up, the first major competition since the breakup, and the pressure was clearly getting to him. He was stretched out on the couch, his head in its now familiar place on my lap. I was absently scrolling through photos on my laptop, the soft glow illuminating his face. He hadn't spoken in nearly an hour, and I assumed he was asleep. His eyes were closed, his breathing even. I paused my scrolling, my gaze falling on him. In the dim light, he looked younger, the lines of stress around his eyes smoothed away. A wave of tenderness, so powerful it was almost painful, washed over me. I had to physically restrain my hand from reaching out to brush a stray piece of hair from his forehead. "I'm not asleep," his voice was a low murmur, startling me out of my reverie. My hand, which had been hovering in the air, dropped back to the keyboard. "Oh," I said, my voice catching. "Sorry. I thought you were." He didn't open his eyes. "It's okay. It's nice." The quiet, another silence settled between us, but this one felt different. It wasn't empty. It was charged, humming with a low-grade electrical current. I could feel the tension in his body, a subtle tautness in his neck and shoulders that hadn't been there moments before. My own heart began to pick up its pace, a nervous thrum against my ribs. Something was shifting. The tectonic plates were moving again. He opened his eyes. He didn't look up at the ceiling or around the room. He looked directly up at me. His gaze was intense, searching. It felt as if he were seeing me for the first time, not as a comfortable fixture in his life, but as a person, separate and entire. The noise of the world seemed to fade away, until the only things that existed were his eyes, dark and deep, and the frantic pounding of my own blood in my ears. The air grew thick, heavy. I couldn't look away. I felt pinned by his gaze, exposed and vulnerable in a way I never had been before. All my carefully constructed walls, my fortress of platonic friendship, felt like they were turning to dust. "Alex," he said, and my name was a fragile thing in the quiet room. He slowly, deliberately, pushed himself up, moving from my lap to sit beside me. The sudden loss of his weight was a physical shock. He didn't move away, though. He moved closer. We were sitting face to face, our knees almost touching. The space between us was now impossibly small, a mere inches of charged air. He looked from my eyes to my mouth and then back to my eyes again. It was a classic tell, the kind of thing you see in movies, but happening in my living room. To me, it felt like the world was tilting on its axis. My breath hitched. This was it. This was the moment where the story could change forever, or where it could shatter into a million irreparable pieces. He lifted a hand, his movements slow, tentative, as if he were afraid I would bolt. He didn't touch my face. He rested his palm gently on the couch, next to my leg, his thumb just barely brushing against the denim of my jeans. It was a gesture of immense restraint, and it was more intimate than any touch had been before. It was a question. "Can I ask you something?" he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion I couldn't name. I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. He held my gaze, and his own eyes were filled with a terrifying mixture of fear and determination. "Would it be okay?" he started, then stopped, swallowing hard. He took a breath and tried again. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The question hung in the air between us, shimmering and fragile. It was not a demand. It was not a move. It was a plea. It was the most vulnerable thing I had ever heard. He was giving me all the power. He was laying his heart at my feet and asking me what to do with it. And in that moment, all my fear, all my carefully constructed defenses, all my mantras about being just a friend, they all dissolved. They were no match for the raw, terrifying honesty in his eyes. My entire being screamed yes. Yes, it would be okay. Yes, it's all I've ever wanted. But the word wouldn't come. Instead, I did the only thing I could think to do. I closed the infinitesimal distance between us and pressed my mouth to his. It was not a cinematic kiss. There was no sudden swell of music, no dramatic explosion of passion. It was quiet. It was hesitant. It was unbelievably soft. His lips were tentative against mine, questioning. It was a kiss that tasted of tea and salt and a deep, unspoken longing. For a moment, we were both perfectly still, just the gentle pressure of our mouths connecting, a silent confirmation. Then, I felt his hand, the one that had been resting on the couch, move to my neck, his fingers tangling in the hair at my nape, a silent plea for me to stay, not to pull away. A soft sound, a sigh or a sob, escaped his throat, and he deepened the kiss, a slow, gentle exploration. It was a kiss of discovery, of dawning recognition. It was a conversation we had been waiting our whole lives to have, and it was happening without a single word. I brought my hand up to his cheek, my thumb stroking the rough stubble along his jaw. He was real. This was real. The boy with the laugh that silenced a room was kissing me in the quiet of my living room, and the world did not end. It began. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. We didn't move away. We rested our foreheads together, our eyes closed, just breathing the same air. The silence that followed was not awkward or uncertain. It was a new kind of silence, one filled not with unspoken tension, but with a profound and shared peace. It was the quiet after a storm has finally passed, leaving behind a world that is washed clean and new. "Okay," he whispered, his breath warm against my lips. I understood. It wasn't a question anymore. It was an answer. It was an acknowledgement. It was the beginning of a new language. I opened my eyes and looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, the boy I saw was not a friend I was secretly in love with. He was just mine, and I was his. The crossing had been made. We were on the other side. The aftermath was not the explosion of romantic bliss I might have naively fantasized about in my most private moments. Instead, it was defined by a quiet, pervasive, and utterly terrifying awkwardness. The morning after the kiss was a landscape of unspoken questions. I woke up first, as I always did, but the familiar routine was shattered. He was still asleep on the couch, but the sight of him no longer filled me with a secret, lonely tenderness. It filled me with a buzzing, anxious dread. The blanket was tangled around his legs. His face was peaceful in the gray morning light, and all I could think was, what have we done? The kiss had felt like a destination, a resolution. But in the stark light of day, it felt like a starting pistol for a race I didn't know how to run. I made coffee, the familiar ritual, a flimsy anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The sound of the grinder felt deafeningly loud. Every normal household noise seemed amplified, charged with a new and uncomfortable significance. When he finally stirred, my back was to him. I heard the rustle of the blanket, the soft groan as he stretched. I braced myself. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. I turned, forcing a smile that felt like a grimace. "Morning. Coffee's on." He sat up, running a hand through his messy hair, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at the floor, at his hands, at a loose thread on the couch cushion, anywhere but at me. The easy intimacy of the night before had evaporated, replaced by a thick, transparent wall between us. He took the mug I offered him, our fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. We both flinched. The casual contact that had become our norm was now fraught, a reminder of the line we had crossed. We drank our coffee in a silence that was heavy and suffocating. It was the opposite of the peaceful quiet after the kiss. This was a silence of retreat, of regret. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension. "Are we okay? What was that? Do you feel it too?" But the words were trapped in my throat, tangled in a net of fear. I was terrified that if I spoke, I would shatter the fragile, beautiful thing that had happened, that I would find out it was a mistake, a moment of weakness on his part that he now regretted. And I didn't think I could bear that. He left quickly. He invented a flimsy excuse about needing to get to the library early, a story neither of us believed. "I'll, see you later," he said at the door, still not quite looking at me. "Yeah, see you," I replied to the side of his head. And then he was gone. The door clicked shut, and the silence he left behind was immense. I stood in my living room, the space that had been our sanctuary, and it suddenly felt like a crime scene. The couch, the blanket, the empty coffee mug on the table, they were all evidence of something that I no longer understood. The hope that had bloomed so brightly the night before was now curdling into a cold, sick dread in the pit of my stomach. I had misinterpreted everything. It had been a fluke, a moment of grief-induced confusion. He was pulling away, and I had let myself believe, for one beautiful, stupid night, that he was moving closer. The next few days were a special kind of hell. He didn't come over. My evenings, which had been filled with his presence for months, were suddenly cavernous and empty. The silence in my apartment was no longer peaceful, it was mocking. He answered my texts, but his replies were short, perfunctory. One-word answers. Delayed responses. He was busy. He was tired. He had a lot of training. Each message was a small, polite brick being placed in a wall he was building between us. I saw him on campus once, from a distance. He was with his teammates, laughing at something one of them said. It was the bright, public laugh, the one I'd first heard at the party. He looked fine. He looked normal. He looked like a boy who hadn't whispered, "Would it be okay?" in the dark. He looked like a boy who hadn't kissed me like I was the first drop of water after a decade in the desert. The sight of him, so casually and completely himself, while I felt like I was falling apart, was a physical blow. Hurt began to curdle into anger. It was a slow burn, a frustration that started in my chest and spread through my limbs. It wasn't just that he was avoiding me. It was the dishonesty of it. The cowardice. He had initiated it. He had asked the question. He had crossed the line. And now he was pretending it never happened, leaving me alone on the other side, confused and heartbroken. He was treating me like a mistake he was trying to erase. And after everything, after all the nights I had sat with him, after all the pain I had absorbed, after I had made my home his home, I deserved better than that. I deserved more than a ghost. I deserved an explanation. After nearly a week of this torturous silence, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. The not knowing was worse than any possible truth. I had to confront him. I had to force the conversation he was so desperately trying to avoid. My fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but the anger was stronger. It was a fuel. I sent him a text, my thumbs shaking slightly. We need to talk. My place. Tonight. There was no room for negotiation in the words. It was a summons. For a long time, there was no reply. I stared at my phone, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was sure he would ignore it, that he would make another excuse. Then, finally, 3 dots appeared, disappeared, and reappeared. A single word materialized on the screen. Okay. He arrived at my door exactly on time. A punctuality that was so unlike his usual casual self that it only heightened my anxiety. When I opened the door, he looked terrible. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his skin was pale. The confident, easygoing athlete was gone again, replaced by the haunted look he'd worn in the weeks after his breakup. The sight of his distress almost made my anger falter, but I held on to it. I needed it. I stepped back and let him in without a word. He walked into the center of the living room and just stood there, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking like a defendant in a trial. I closed the door and turned to face him, my arms crossed over my chest, a defensive posture I didn't even realize I was taking. So, I began, my voice colder than I intended. Are you going to keep pretending I don't exist? He flinched, but he didn't deny it. He just shook his head, his eyes fixed on the floor. No, he said, his voice barely a whisper. What's going on, Leo? I pressed, my voice gaining a raw, pleading edge despite myself. One night, you're kissing me, and the next, you can't even look at me. You can't send a text message with more than 3 words. What the hell happened? He finally looked up, and his eyes were swimming with a miserable confusion that was so profound it stole my breath. I don't know, he said, and the words sounded like they were being torn out of him. I freaked out, you freaked out. I repeated, a bitter, incredulous laugh escaping me. That's it. You kiss me like that, and then you just freak out and disappear? Do you have any idea how that felt? I'm sorry, he whispered, and he looked so genuinely wretched that my anger began to dissolve, replaced by the familiar, aching tenderness. Leo, talk to me, I said, my voice softening. Please, just tell me what's going on in your head. I can't do this silence. He took a deep, shuddering breath and finally, he started to talk. I've never felt that way before, he stammered, gesturing vaguely between us. For anyone. Not like that. And it scared the hell out of me. He started pacing, a restless, caged energy radiating from him. All my life, things have been simple. I swim. I go to class. I had a girlfriend. It was a straight line. And then, with you, it's not a straight line. It's something else entirely, and I don't have a map for it. He stopped pacing and faced me, his expression desperate. That night, when I kissed you, it was the most honest thing I think I've ever done. It felt right. More right than anything has felt in a very long time. And the next morning, I woke up, and I was terrified. Because I didn't know what it meant. About me. About us. What if I was just confused? What if I was just lonely after Chloe, and I was using you for comfort? His voice broke on the last few words. I couldn't stand the thought of that, he whispered. I couldn't stand the thought of hurting you like that. You're the best person I know, Alex. The thought of messing this up, of losing you, it was easier to just run, and there it was. The confession. It wasn't a confession of love, not in the way I had dreamed. It was a confession of fear, of confusion. But underneath it all, there was a kernel of truth I had been so desperate to find. It felt right. He had felt it too. He wasn't running from me. He was running from the feeling. He was running from himself. I closed the space between us, standing directly in front of him, forcing him to meet my eyes. Do you think I'm that fragile? I asked softly. Do you think I haven't been confused or scared? Leo, I have been living in that state for more than a year. His eyes widened, a flicker of surprise and understanding dawning in them. You? Yes, me, I said, a small, weary smile touching my lips. I didn't just become your friend and hope for the best. I fell for you the night we met. That laugh, it wrecked me from day one. Every night you spent on that couch, I was in agony. A wonderful, terrible agony. So don't you dare talk to me about being scared. And don't you dare think you can protect me by running away. That's the one thing that will hurt me. Tears welled in his eyes, and he didn't try to hide them. I'm so sorry, he choked out. I've been such an idiot. Yes, I agreed, but my voice was gentle. You have, but it's okay. I reached out and took his hand, lacing my fingers with his. His skin was cold, but his grip was strong, desperate. So what now? He asked, his voice small, like a child's. What do we do? I looked at our joined hands, then back up at his face. The fear was still there, but it was mingled with a fragile, flickering hope. And I knew, in that moment, that my own fear was gone, burned away by the fire of his confession and my own. All that was left was a quiet certainty. Now, I said, my voice steady and clear. You stop running, and we figure it out. Together, a tear finally escaped and traced a path down his cheek. He nodded, a slow, solemn movement. And then, he leaned in and kissed me again. This time, there was no hesitation. There was no questioning. It was a kiss of homecoming. It was a promise. The conflict was over. The real work, the work of building something new from the beautiful, honest wreckage, was just beginning. The resolution didn't arrive like a sudden sunrise, flooding our world with immediate, brilliant light. It was more like a slow dawn, a gradual lightening of the sky, where colors and shapes emerged slowly from the gray uncertainty of what had come before. After our confrontation, after the tears and the confessions, a new kind of quiet settled between us. But this one was different. It was a quiet of intention. The heavy, unspoken questions had been replaced by a shared, acknowledged vulnerability. We were two people who had admitted they were lost and had agreed to find their way together. That night, for the first time, he didn't sleep on the couch. After we had talked for what felt like hours, untangling the knots of his fear and my longing, a familiar exhaustion settled over him. He started to gravitate toward the couch, the force of habit pulling him toward his established place of rest. I watched him for a moment, then spoke softly. Leo, he stopped and looked at me, a question in his tired eyes. I simply tilted my head toward the hallway, toward my open bedroom door. It was the invitation I had silently screamed for months, now spoken in a simple gesture. He hesitated for only a second. A flicker of the old fear crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by something else, a look of profound relief. He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible motion, and followed me. My bedroom, which had for so long been my solitary fortress, felt different with him in it. It felt complete. There was no grand romantic scene. It was awkward and gentle. We brushed our teeth side by side in my small bathroom, occasionally bumping elbows, our eyes meeting in the mirror in small, shy glances. I gave him a t-shirt to sleep in, and when I turned back from my closet, he was standing there, shirtless, and the sight of him, not as a swimmer in a public pool, but as a man in the private space of my bedroom, made my breath catch in my throat. He seemed to sense my gaze, a faint blush rising on his chest. The vulnerability was now mutual, a shared currency between us. We got into my bed, a space that had always felt too large for one person, and it was a moment of quiet revelation. It felt simply right. He lay on his back, and I lay on my side, facing him, a few inches of space between us. The air was electric. Is this okay? He whispered into the dark, echoing his question from the night of the first kiss, but this time it held a different meaning. It wasn't about a single act. It was about this new, terrifying, wonderful reality. It's more than okay, I whispered back. I reached across the small space between us and took his hand. He immediately laced his fingers with mine, his grip firm and sure. He turned his head on the pillow to face me. In the dim light filtering in from the street, I could just make out the shape of his face, the curve of his smile. "I'm sorry it took me so long to figure this out," he said, his voice low and sincere. "Some people are just slow learners," I teased gently. He squeezed my hand. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For waiting. For not giving up on me." I brought his hand to my lips and kissed his knuckles. "I wasn't going anywhere," I said. And we lay there like that, holding hands in the dark, until the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing told me he was asleep. For the first time, I didn't stay awake to listen. I let his presence lull me into the most peaceful sleep I had had in years. Our new normal was built in these small moments of quiet domesticity. The couch was retired from its duties as his bed. It became just a couch again, a place where we would sit together, now with no ambiguity. He would still rest his head in my lap, but now I would run my fingers through his hair, an act of simple, uncomplicated affection. He started keeping a toothbrush in my bathroom, and a few of his sweatshirts found their way into my closet. My apartment, once my solitary refuge, slowly and organically became our shared space. We learned the rhythms of living together. I learned that he was obsessively neat in some ways and hopelessly messy in others. He learned that I couldn't function without my first cup of coffee in the morning and that I often lost track of time when I was editing photos. We were mapping each other's territories, not as friends, but as partners. The photography changed again. I started taking pictures of him that were filled with light. I took a photo of him one morning, standing in my kitchen, backlit by the sun streaming through the window, a sleepy, happy smile on his face as he made us breakfast. The image was so full of warmth and joy it almost hurt to look at. When I showed it to him, he wrapped his arms around me from behind and rested his chin on my shoulder, looking at the camera's small screen. "That's how you see me?" he asked, his voice soft. "That's how I've always seen you," I replied honestly. "I just didn't think you'd ever see me back." He tightened his arms around me. "I was blind," he said, "but I'm learning to see." There were still moments of fear, of uncertainty. They didn't just vanish. One afternoon, he came home from practice looking troubled. He was quiet, distant. The old anxiety flickered in my chest. We sat on the couch, and after a long silence, he finally spoke. "One of the guys on the team asked about Chloe today," he said, staring at his hands. And then he asked if I was seeing anyone new. And I didn't know what to say. So I just said no. The words stung, but I looked at his face, at the shame and confusion there, and I understood. This was still new territory for him. The map was still being drawn. "It's okay," I said, taking his hand. "We don't have to have a label. We don't have to announce anything to anyone. This," I said, gesturing to the room, "to us, is for us. We can go at your pace." He looked at me, his eyes full of gratitude. "Really, really," I confirmed. "All that matters is what happens in here." Between us, he leaned over and kissed me, a deep, grateful kiss. "I love you," he said, the words quiet but clear. They were the first time either of us had said them. My heart, which I thought had already done all the acrobatics it was capable of, seemed to stop and then restart, beating with a new and powerful rhythm. "I love you too," I said, and the words felt like the truest thing I had ever spoken. We found our peace not in grand declarations, but in the gentle accumulation of ordinary days. It was in the way he'd bring me a mug of tea when I was lost in my work in the darkroom. It was in the way I'd know just from the sound of his key in the lock what kind of day he'd had. It was in the comfortable silence that could stretch for hours while we occupied the same room, each engrossed in our own tasks, yet deeply aware and comforted by the other's presence. The love we were building was not a roaring fire. It was a deep, steady warmth, a hearth we had built together, stone by stone. It was a sanctuary. The door was no longer a symbol of a painful distance. It was just a door to a room that we now shared, a room we closed at night to the rest of the world. Sometimes I think back to that first night, standing in the hallway, agonizing over a simple blanket. I think about the boy on the couch and the boy standing in the doorway, both of them lonely in their own ways, separated by just a few feet of floorboards and an ocean of fear. It feels like a lifetime ago. That boy, the quiet observer, never could have imagined this. He never could have imagined the simple, profound peace of waking up in the morning next to the person who was once the subject of his most secret, hopeless daydreams. He wouldn't have believed that the same laugh that once made him forget everyone else in the room would become the familiar, beloved soundtrack to his everyday life. Life, I've learned, is a process of developing. You live in the darkroom of your own experiences, your own fears and uncertainties, and you wait. You wait for the images to emerge. You can't rush it. You can only be patient and gentle and trust in the chemistry of time and love. You trust that eventually, out of the gray ambiguity, a picture will resolve. A picture that is clear and true and more beautiful than you ever could have hoped. And as I watch Leo now, asleep beside me, his face peaceful in the early morning light, I know that our picture has finally developed. And it is perfect. We began to heal, not in a grand gesture, but in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned, at last, to create together.